I'm going to give sort of a fast run through the work that I've done in Guatemala, how I came to write Textures of Terror, how this book about the murder of a law student in Guatemala is connected to larger issues of corruption, gender violence, and migration that ultimately are connected to deep-seated inequality in Guatemala. So this image in the first PowerPoint is from the trial of General Efrain Ríos Montt for genocide in Guatemala in 2013. His conviction was the first time that a genocidaire was convicted of the crime of genocide in a domestic court in the country where it had taken place. And this is a woman from the Ixil area who's recounting what happened during the genocide in Guatemala. It's not working here. Okay, there, sorry. So when I first started working in Guatemala in the late 1990s, my first trip actually to Guatemala is in 1990, and I started working with the Guatemalan Forensic Anthropology Foundation in 1994 in this area of Baja Verapaz. Guatemala City is here. This region right here is heavily indigenous and where a lot of the violence in Guatemala took place. So as Fazil mentioned, this was my first book. This was basically an ethnography of the exhumation of a clandestine cemetery in a community called Plan de Sanchez, where a massacre had taken place in 1982. 12 years later, we were doing an exhumation at the request of the community. This was before the peace accords had been signed. It was before the UN was there. It was when there were still about 1 million men in the country forcibly charged with participating in army-controlled civil patrols. And it was a really significant moment in this community that had been silenced about what it had suffered in a massacre that killed more than 200 women and children and youth in that community. In 2003, the same year that Buried Secrets was published, I was asked to publish a part of the book in Guatemala because one of the main arguments that I made was that what had happened was a genocide, and that this genocide was led under the command responsibility of Efrain Ríos Montt. And for those of you who are familiar with the Genocide Convention, you'll remember that one of the issues in the convention is intent to commit genocide. And so if one can demonstrate command responsibility, that a decision was made that there are intellectual and material authors and a chain of command, then one can demonstrate that there was intent to commit genocide. And the reason this was important is that in 2003, General Efrain Ríos Montt, who had led the genocide in 1982 after he came to power through a military coup in March of 1982, in 2003, he was running for president in Guatemala, even though a new constitution included a clause that said anyone who came to power through military coup would not be able to run for president. However, the military in 2003 still had the court stacked. And what that meant was when Ríos Montt took that to the court as a challenge, saying he had a right to run for president, the court ruled that the Constitution was enacted after he had come to power through military coup, and therefore couldn't be retroactive, meaning that only people who came to power through military coup in the future wouldn't be able to run for president. So they were allowing him to run for president. So the publication of this book in Guatemala demonstrating that he had command responsibility over the genocide was part of a national and international campaign against his candidacy. Unfortunately, he did lose. Interestingly enough, this book is now being published in Portuguese in Brazil this very month, and you'll notice they've slightly changed the title. It's called Genocide in Guatemala, the First General Convicted in Latin America. And what the little blurb on the back actually talks about is how Bolsonaro committed genocide during the pandemic in Brazil against indigenous communities. And so for me, and it also speaks about the role of the CIA and the United States in violence in Latin America. And so one of the things that's interesting to me about this book, and that I kind of love, is as a public scholar, which is what I consider myself to be, I want to contribute to larger policy conversations about human rights and justice. And it makes me really happy to have this work taken and appropriated and used, and that it's still useful 20 years later in another country on a related topic. After that, as Fazil mentioned, I published Engaged Observer, Anthropology, Advocacy, and Activism. When I first started doing my work in the early 1990s, we were told that we had to be objective, and somehow that wasn't seen as contributing to the status quo or furthering injustice. It was seen as just being fine. And so this book was a collection done with my colleague Isabel and Jolajani, and we brought together anthropologists who worked in different parts of the world to talk about what it meant to be an engaged observer, not someone going in with colonial intentions, but someone who's doing research and is asked by a community to support them in their local movements or causes for justice. And this image actually is from northern Choco in Colombia in the peace communities where Asali and I were doing research in the early 2000s. I ended up doing this work on feminicide, on the killing of women in Guatemala, because in the early 2000s, since 2006, I was in Guatemala and asked to accompany the father of Claudina, Isabel, Velasquez. And I hadn't really considered Guatemala City. I hadn't really thought about violence in the city or contemporary homicide. All my work had really been focused on genocide in Guatemala. And the person who invited me to meet Jorge was Amilcar Mendez, who's a human rights leader in Guatemala who'd worked in indigenous communities. And usually when he asked me if I would help someone, he was asking me to accompany an indigenous person somewhere in a rural community who wasn't being treated fairly, and just the presence of an international could often make a difference for them. And so I was really surprised when I got to Amilcar's home and met Jorge, who's taller than me and whiter than me and upper middle class and an auditor and conservative and evangelical. And I just thought, he clearly speaks Spanish better than I do, so why does he need me? But what I didn't understand was that justice didn't work anywhere in the country, and in particular on issues of gender violence. And so because Jorge is an auditor, and because I'm a participant observer anthropologist, together what we ended up doing was an audit of the legal system and the way that homicides of women, femicides, the killing of women, how that's treated in the legal system, from the crime scene to the morgue, to the prosecutor's office, to the courts. And so we published this book in 2000. What year was this published? 2008. 2008. And it was out fast to get this in the public discourse, to start talking about changes that needed to be made. The following year, I published La Masacre de Panzos, the massacre in Panzos, ethnicity, land, and violence in Guatemala. And this was continuing to publish work that I had done in the late 1990s and early 2000s with the Guatemalan Truth Commission. And so this book came out. I'm not going to go into a lot because I want to make sure I keep to my time. But in the middle of finishing that, I was also thinking about gender violence. And so along with Caterina and Cecilia, we did this edited volume, Gender Violence in Peace and War, starting to look at, well, what are the structures of inequality? What are the structures of violence that create this situation where women are always subject to violence, whether it's in a state of peace or a state of war? And the pieces in this volume, there's a beautiful piece that Fazil wrote about his research in the Kurdish region of Iraq. There are pieces from Indonesia, from Chiapas, from Russia, from Guatemala. And this image on the cover was taken by my colleague Jonathan Moeller in 1994. And the woman in the photo is Ana Lopez, who's from an area of northern Quiché, the Ixcan area. And in this image, she's sitting with her child, and she is basically sitting in the ashes of what had been her home that had been burned down 12 years earlier. the interesting thing I think about this photo is that there are always possibilities for transformation. Anna was unable to complete primary school because her community was massacred. She grew up in flight and in refuge, but she later was able to complete primary school, complete high school, go to the university, and today Ana Lopez is a lawyer. And she is the president of the Maya Lawyers Association in Guatemala. And in fact, a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, she was in Geneva presenting a report on the status of Indigenous women's rights at the Commission for Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And one of the things I think is really important about this as well is when I started working in Guatemala, there were no Maya women lawyers. There were 3 or 4 women who actually had advanced university degrees because the discrimination was so deep. Guatemala is a majority Indigenous country, but Indigenous people in general and Maya women in particular had very little access to education. Even setting out the genocide that happened in the early 1980s, it was simply not part of what was allowed in that society. But today there are a lot of Maya women lawyers, and Ana is one of them, who's leading really important cases on issues of gender violence, sexual slavery during the genocide, but also contemporary cases of extraction against mining companies that are illegally extracting resources from Maya communities and also polluting the environment. So this work on contemporary gender violence took me to think about stories that women had told me when I was collecting information for the Truth Commission about sexual violence that happened, and the way that there were clear patterns, because I worked in a lot of different parts of Guatemala, there were clear patterns of sexual violence that had taken place. And I have 2 colleagues, Sofia Alvarez Arenas and Kathleen Dill, who had also worked in Guatemala at that same time in different areas, and we had discussed this issue before, and so we decided to do this book together in Guatemala, connecting the systematic ways in which sexual violence was used by the Guatemalan military during the genocide. This image on the cover was taken in the Ixil area in 1982 by the Swedish photographer Ulf Anir, who's one of the few photographers who was in that region at that time. And then that brings me to the book that was published this year, Textures of Terror. This is Claudina Isabel. She was a 19-year-old law student when she was murdered. In the background on the violence that exists today, these were the findings of the Truth Commission. 626 villages were massacred, 1.5 million people were displaced, 150,000 people fled to refuge. In Mexico, more than 200,000 dead or disappeared. And this was a situation of state terrorism. The Guatemalan army carried out a generalized systematic attack on the civilian population. The army campaigns were specifically directed at the indigenous population with the goal of extermination. This was a planned genocide in Guatemala. And these, I'm going to go through these really fast because we have time issues, but so this is the map of Guatemala. This is Guatemala City. This is the area I was telling you that I had worked in previously. And this is 1971 to 1980. These red dots, each dot represents a disappearance or a killing. So it's 1971 to 1980. This is 1980 to 1983. This is the height of the genocide in Guatemala. And then even 1984 to 1996, when the peace accords were signed, you can still see that the levels of violence were incredibly high. So genocide is a gendered atrocity because of the intention to destroy a cultural group. And so one of the ways that you destroy a cultural group is by destroying the community as well as its reproductive capacity. And in this way, women and girls become the targets of genocide. So one of the ways to establish the high point of the genocide is to look at the apex, where you compare male and female deaths during the genocide. And so this is what we did. This is in Baja Verapaz, one of the regions where I worked. And this point right here, this is women being killed. This is men being killed. the number of men, the absolute number is not going down. It's that the absolute number of women is going up. So the percentage of men is going down. And this apex right here is June of 1982. Rios Montt came to power in March. So that's March, April, May, June. 3 months into his regime, women now become more than 50% of the victims of the killings. And that's because there were massacres that happened before where they killed men and boys. And now they're going back into communities and wiping out everyone. And also to put those numbers into a context, all of this violence happened in a country that had about 8 million people at the time. So if you have 1.2 million people displaced, that's 1 out of every 8 individuals. And those people who survived, whatever you're wearing right now, that's what they were wearing for the next 2 or 3 years if they survived in flight in the mountains from the army. So in the Truth Commission report, 99% of the acts of sexual violence were committed by the army and other state security forces, and 1% were committed by guerrilla forces. And now, comparing the women being killed during the genocide, this is 1982, number of women who were killed each year, it's over 600. You can see it starts to drop down after the height of the genocide, and then it kind of moves around and climbs up. But then look at this, by 2006, when I started accompanying Jorge, the number of women who are being killed has reached the same number as existed before. And this is Claudina Isabel. She was killed in August of 2005. She went to a party in the evening and she was never seen again. Her parents identified her the next morning in the morgue at 11 o'clock. When Jorge and I were going through the case and looking at deficiencies, I know I'm running almost out of time, so I'm not going to read all of these to you, but these are lists of deficiencies in the murder investigation. There was no search for a weapon. There was no search for phone records. The ballistics report, this is one of the most damning ones, I believe. The ballistics report that was submitted, it said it was submitted, the casings were submitted on February 2nd, 2005, and then the analysis was received on February 28th. It's 6 months before the date of Claudina's murder. So all of what little information was collected was not done properly, but mostly nothing was done. And the actual forensic mistakes, there are huge and tremendous mistakes that were made in the morgue by the medical examiner, from not taking fingerprints and nail clippings during the autopsy, discrepancies on the kinds of injuries that were reported, and also a real lack of respect for Claudina Isabel as a victim. They never had her name on her case. It said Ekis, which in the U.S., like an unknown is classified as Jane Doe. In Guatemala, it's Ekis. The thing is, she was identified the morning after she had been murdered, but she was identified by her parents, and the file in the morgue, it still said Ekis. And in fact, every single individual, from the police to the prosecutor to the medical examiner, continued to refer to Claudina Isabel as Ekis. And one of the reasons that this is really significant is that at this time, the police in Guatemala said, well, all these women who are being killed are gang members or prostitutes, because no one even comes and identifies them. We don't even know who they are. Well, we can't really believe that when we know that Claudina Isabel's parents identified her the morning after she was killed. And the only reason her name was finally attached to her file is that in November, and she was murdered in August and identified in August, in November, her name was finally put on the official file of her case because her father hired a lawyer and went to court to get an administrative order forcing the police, the prosecutor, and the morgue to put her name on the file. And still, after that, in documents in the morgue, the medical examiner refers to her as Ekis. And so you can see a complete disconnect between the reality of what's happening to women on the ground and the incapacity or unwillingness of the state to do its job. So why is it feminicide? Feminicide builds on the concept of femicide in criminology literature. In feminist literature, it's a crime of hate against women. It is the killing of women by men because they're women. Feminicide also holds responsible male perpetrators, the state, and judicial structures. Impunity, silence, indifference, and the normalization of misogyny play a role in feminicide. In the context of feminicide in Guatemala, and violence against women is organized crime, drug trafficking, gang corruption, sexual trafficking, the history of state involvement in commission, toleration, or omission of these crimes, patriarchal structures, and community silencing of victims of gender violence. And, you know, impunity, when we think of impunity, we think of an exemption from punishment, people getting away with committing crimes, an absence of the rule of law. Impunity is also an invitation to commit crimes in this ambience. And in Guatemala, it's the violation of the law by those charged with upholding it because of the deep corruption that maintains deep structures of inequality in Guatemala. I took this photo in the central market of Guatemala City in 2006, 10 years after the signing of the peace accords. You have heavily armed men in uniforms in a vehicle with no license plate and no insignia identifying to whom it belongs or what group they belong to. So in the case of Claudina Isabel, there was a failure to investigate, and research that was done by the United Nations Commission Against Impunity showed that only 43% of gender cases were even accepted. That doesn't mean they were opened or worked on, but just accepted. But that means 57% of the cases were never investigated at all. No one ever even made a folder for those cases. And so it's not surprising that the impunity rate for gender violence was 98%. That means that 98% of the women who were murdered or beaten or suffered some form of gender violence never saw any kind of justice. And these are reported cases. It doesn't count all the people who don't report because they don't believe in the system. So moving right along, the state has responsibility for violence against women by commission of the crimes, toleration of the crimes, or omission of state responsibility to fulfill its obligation to investigate and sanction gender violence. These aren't private issues. These are public issues because the structures are allowing this to take place. So in 2015, because of the inability of or unwillingness of the Guatemalan government to do its job, Jorge Velasquez and his family took the case to the Inter-American Court, and the Inter-American Court ruled against the government of Guatemala in 2015, ordering moral reparations, some reforms, and damages for the family, which if you want to know more about that, I can answer that in the Q&A if you want. So the issue is all of these things need to be connected back to violence and corruption. And also in the case of my country, understanding why there are so many women traveling through Mexico, which is very dangerous, with their children to get to the border where they are mistreated. What kind of desperation do you have to live in? So in my book, one of the things that I talk about is the criminalization of prosecutors. Just like there was a Me Too movement in the United States, in Guatemala, there was one called #TengoMiedo, #IamAfraid. And there are 38 Guatemalan anti-corruption justice operators driven into exile since 2018. There was a 70% approval rating for CICIG, the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which was thrown out of the country by a corrupt president. When CICIG was operating, the migration rate out of Guatemala dropped 35% in the first year. When CICIG was blocked by the corrupt president, there was a record number of Guatemalans coming to the US border. So, you know, women are fleeing for their lives and also to protect their children. So now I'll do my fast roundup. I think I have about 3 minutes left of what is happening in Guatemala today. The representatives, indigenous authorities, this is autoridades indígenas, the indigenous authorities of 48 cantones. The cantones are villages of Totonicapán. They have an incredibly organized structure in their community. They presented a constitutional request for the corrupt Attorney General of Guatemala to step down because she has been blocking the transition to the new president who was elected in August, Bernardo Arevalo. He received over 60% of the vote by a very popular mandate because he was an anti-corruption candidate. And the current Attorney General has basically criminalized prosecutors criminalized journalists. One of the biggest newspapers in Guatemala was closed down. The publisher is now in prison. There are two significant and important prosecutors who are in prison, who are anti-corruption prosecutors. That's why there are 38 other justice operators who fled the country, including former attorneys general from that country. All of that that's affecting these justice operators is also affecting regular people who live throughout the country. And so the indigenous authorities of this community presented this mandate, this statement, this request, and here they are when they went to present it. And what started as a protest, what started as a call, they called for a national strike. It has just grown, and people have been coming from all over. These are from different, this is from Rabina. It says, go away, corrupt people. We don't want you here. This says, this was in 10 days of resistance, peaceful, indigenous, community, and popular resistance. We refuse to live under a dictatorship, because if the democratically elected president isn't allowed to take office, effectively the democracy in Guatemala will shut down. And the people have basically refused it, and they've gone out into the streets. And this is what it looks like, people leaving their rural communities. And you can see how heavy their backpacks are, because they're carrying food and water, because they don't know how many days they're going to be out there for. And now it's 22 days, and they're out there day and night in every village, in every community. They pray, they carry the national flag, they sing the national anthem. I'm running out of time. I'll just show you.
I actually have no kids at the moment. Maybe if when you come back.
I'm out of time. That's what we're saying. Fazil, am I out of time? I'm sorry. I heard someone talking about something. Okay, I can't hear anybody. So I'll just finish.
Okay. You can continue. You got 1 minute.
Okay, because I thought I heard someone say I was out of time. Something came in. So anyway, you can see all these people are protesting. They're out day and night. It requires a lot of food. So they're like community. The women are making food for everyone. They've got the pots, they've got the wood, they're out in the streets. They've stopped the traffic in the country, but they allow, this says we let pickups with fruit and vegetables and basic milk, ambulances, and people who need medical attention through. This is what the country looks like today. This image was taken yesterday in the morning or the evening before. All these images are from Prensa Comunitaria, the community press in Guatemala that's covering this on Instagram and on social media, on Facebook. All of these points are points where they have stopped the road. So there is no movement basically throughout Guatemala. This is a list of all the roads that are blocked. And of course, there have been some infiltrators that have gone in, but in fact, the violence has been really quite low. They have sent out the anti-riot police, but masses of people have peacefully surrounded them and stopped them from moving forward. And day and night, people are out like these women. And in fact, I just want to point out, like, she's holding that image that one woman's holding is an image of someone who died previously, right, in previous violence, because these are the communities that suffered these massacres. They remember that violence and they don't want it. They don't want it back. They don't want it anymore. And they've come from all over. And now they have signs that say, we love the 48 cantones, because it was this one community that started what became a national movement. And when they block the roads, this says venceremos, we shall overcome, we shall win. I mean, I think it's incredibly inspiring to see this in times that are really dark in so many parts of the world. And it's not that it's not challenging in Guatemala, obviously it is, or everyone wouldn't be out on the streets. The day before yesterday, one of the leaders, a woman, one of the leaders of the indigenous movement, she said, we began this as a national strike, but today it's an uprising, and we won't stop raising our faces until we have justice. And I believe that they will, and I hope that they do, and I thank you for listening to me. So I'm done. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you so much, Victoria. Stay with us. We're going to the next speaker now.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to the Institute. Thank you, Fazil. Happy to be in conversation with Victoria, with Srila. And I want to thank Tobile and Emilia, who made my travel and accommodation possible. I thought I would just start by reading a few quotes from the book, which is made of 40 life histories by women former combatants in the armed struggle. So the first one is from Ambassador Tendwe Mtito. She says, are there contradictions between being a woman and being a soldier? Are we soldiers or are we women or women soldiers? But it doesn't apply for me. They are just soldiers. We are not just supporters. We were and will remain combatants of Umkhonto Wesizwe. In whatever strengths or weaknesses, MK over time also became less patriarchal. If you look at MK in its last days, and I was one of those in its last days in Uganda, end quote. The second one is from my interview with the current Minister of Military Veterans and Defense Force, Minister Thandi Modise. She says, I was in Mahikeng at Barolong High School. We then discussed the students and decided that even though Barolong High School as such was not going to be affected by the Africans, we had another monster looming, Lucas Mangobe, who became the leader of the Bantustan of Bophuthatswana, was preparing for his Bophuthatswana. Suddenly, without consultation, we were going to be taken away from our own country, be parceled into what was Bophuthatswana. We were, without being consulted, losing our citizenship, which in any case at that time, we were trying to talk about and to fight for. I left the country a young woman, wanting to go and do battle, as I said, for the two reasons, education and retention of my citizenship. But I also wanted to fight because at the age of 15, I'd been raped, I'd been impregnated. The courts failed me and my mother. I then decided I wasn't going to pursue school. I was going to join Umkhonto Wesizwe, and in fact, that's what I went on to do. I fought to be a woman, even in the ANC military camps, that it was correct for women to take up arms because certain battles, we believed even then that they could only be won, they could only be understood by other women. That it was not wrong for women to have a voice in any democratic system they were fighting for, because for many generations, African women had been left out. There were very few of us, and so you had to fight over a number of things. In For the Fallen, honoring the unsung heroes and heroines of the liberation struggle, Zwakendlela recounts the life of Bandwini Norman Toto Sengrepe, who was among the 42 people who were killed by the South African Defense Force in Maseru, Lesotho on the morning of 9 December 1982. According to Ndlela, Toto Sengrepe influenced many young people from his hometown of Somerset East and beyond to join the struggle for freedom. He recalls that Toto's sister, Nomsa, and another family member collapsed on hearing the news of their brother's death. Nomsa Ngrepe told me that after the killing of her brother, she was abused in boarding school because of her family name. She felt that the family involvement in politics destined her for political life. And quote, my brother was killed during the Maseru massacre. What happened was that it became well known that there were a whole lot of people who were killed during the Maseru massacre. It was in the newspapers, and my surname was in the newspapers. So when I got to school, I arrived already having a wrong reputation because of my surname, even though they did not know me. But because of my surname was known as one of those who come from families who are active in the struggle, those who are considered problematic by the system. That is why even the administration there had an attitude towards me because of my surname. So in a way, I didn't have a choice. I had to be involved in the struggle, whether I liked it or didn't, because my surname had already spoiled things for me. She then said, at the time I chose that I would go and fight. I would train because I was bitter, because my brother was the breadwinner at home. I realized that everyone was angry, that they took away our breadwinner. I needed to revenge his death. So I decided to go to the army. I just want to read another one about how Makhosazana Xaba came to decide that she was going to train and join Umkhonto weSizwe. She says, I can point to a date on the 29th of October, 1983. Members of Inkatha, Impi, came to university at Ongoye. By the end of the day, 4 students had died and one other person. I made the decision on that day I'll be looking to join. I was never recruited to MK. On that day, I decided I will ask people until somebody tells me who to talk to. That's how I joined MK. Nobody was looking to recruit me, but that event, when men who looked like me came and killed us on our campus, we were university students. I mean, I was much older. I had finished a degree. I had finished a diploma. I was in my 20s, but university students, they are 19, 18, 20, and they came, and these are Black men. That for me changed a lot of what was in my head, because I wasn't sacrificing myself. It was self-preservation, because of what I realized on that day, that if I don't do something to know how to kill and fight back, I'll die, and that would be, for me, a failure on my part, not to have armed myself when experience has shown me that I need to go and be ready to fight and die fighting. I did not want to die not fighting. So for me, it's a story that I can pin to a date. So when the shift of my activism moved from just being a student movement and, doing women's work here and there. And this final quote is from the chapter on combative motherhood. It's 2 quotes, first one by Zoleka Mandela. She says, by the time I was born on 9 April 1980, my mother knew how to strip and assemble an AK-47 in exactly 38 seconds. Next one is by Baleka Mbete. Says, I remember an early morning before I went into exile. Very early morning. My son was on the breast. But as a comrade arrived, it was 4. After 4 o'clock in the morning, because we had to go somewhere. That was the reality of underground work. I had to pull my son from my breast. I'll never forget the feeling of him holding on to my breast, holding on to my nipple, and me pulling him out of the breast, pulling him away from my nipple, and knowing that actually I was unlikely ever to bring him back to that breast. And that was that. So the very final, then I'll make some remarks. And this is from Minister Modise in her keynote in 2021 on women in 60 years of the armed struggle. She says, there are many women in MK who missed a number of things. There may be many women in MK who missed a number of things, find it easy to tell the stories of the armed struggle. But the combination of women and ex-prisoners make it an extra difficult situation. Firstly, some of us are suffering from blockages, where certain things that happened to women have been blocked. They come back in bits and pieces. Sometimes we still dissolve into tears, and sometimes we actually don't get out of our bedrooms because we get used to prison. Somebody who must come and ring a bell, somebody who must unlock somebody who must permit you to walk out, end quote. I say this reflection by Modise provides a rare glimpse into the legacies of occupying the double position of former combatant and prisoner. The reality is that women like her sometimes struggle to get up. They sometimes return to the mindset of a prisoner who must be given permission to get up and walk out. Modise's role as the knitting needles guerrilla is lauded, yet in reality, she spent a longer time as a prisoner than she did as a combatant. The fixation with her combatant identity means that there is little room to reflect on the psychological legacies of her having been a prisoner. I wanted to read these quotes because they speak to the various themes that are raised in the book. This project comes from my doctoral work and an earlier project in 2010 when I was at the Institute for Security Studies, where I had the opportunity working with Professor Cheryl Hendricks to do a documentary project on women and security sector transformation in South Africa. We interviewed Minister Modise, retired Major General Nzikimemela Mutumi, and Mala Singh, who was the former deputy police commissioner and the first woman to take that role. And what their reflections about how their experience as MK women, Modise and Mutumi, showed me was that if I wanted to understand the security sector transformation that we've seen in the South African National Defense as well as the police, I needed to go back and understand what women did in the armed struggle. And so what the book does is to really begin from 1961 to 94 to tease out what women do in these 3 decades of the armed struggle. How did they make sense of it? For 50 years, the ANC had committed itself to nonviolence. So it was a big move after its burning, after the Sharpeville massacre in April 1960, to adopt the armed struggle in 61. And what the book attempts to do is to make sense of what women thought of the shift and the different arenas, even at that time, from the Boko insurrections or the rural-based insurrections of the 1960s to what happens after the uprising in 76, when you have thousands of young people and many of them women who leave the country to be trained as guerrillas. And what happens in the 1980s when we see 2 state of emergencies that also then influence another high number of young people to leave the country. So I try to look at these arenas. I begin in the 1960s. I trace my conceptualization of combative motherhood by looking at what Boko women did in the 1960s. I interviewed women in Nganduli who were arrested in 1963, opposing Bantu authority in the Transkei. I do this to make sense of how the Africanist feelings of the time spread and how women understood them, because that literature, even in the works of people like Professor Kwandi Wenkondlo, really, even Tom Lodge as well, emphasizes the role of migrant male workers who leave the Eastern Cape to go to Cape Town. It doesn't tell us much about how women thought about the imposition of Bantu authority. Then in the 1970s, really the chapter on Umzana focuses on the role of MK women, most of them who live after 1976 and in the 1980s. And this is the time where there is general consensus in the literature that the question of women and the question of gender becomes more prevalent or comes to the fore in the ANC and in MK. And I make the argument through these life histories that a lot of this is because the entry of women raised new questions for MK. For one, they needed to respond to women's material needs. So we see in the work of people like Rachel Sandwell that is after 1976 that we see the increase of pregnancies in the ANC more broadly, but also in the camps. So questions were raised, what do we do with pregnant women in camps in MK? And women were active in pushing against them being removed and sent to Tanzania when they are pregnant, while their male peers remained in the camps. So I look at questions of the sexual politics, but also everyday life in the camps, and also how women thought of their imagery, how they were painted, their experience was painted both externally and inside South Africa. I also look at the question of combat, because as the quote by Mdiso shows us, women resisted being called women soldiers or she soldiers. They wanted to be called fully soldiers. But the point I make in the book is that while there is agreement that MK women received the same training as men, it seems to me, when I look especially at the women, the role of someone like Memela in Operation Vula, as well as Dipuam Velasquez that I focus on, it seems to me that while women received same training as guerrillas, the way that they were deployed as combatants relied on a dynamic use of their femininity and their womanhood. So in the cases of both Memela as well as Dipuam Velasquez, they had to dress up. One had to dress up as young Swazi brides, and Memela is the one who infiltrates Meg Maharaj and Siphiwe Mnyanda for Operation Vula from Swaziland in 1988. And that was relying on both her training, but also on her ability to hide the fact that she was a soldier and perform a certain idea of acceptable womanhood. And I also try to explore, to really tease out what it means for these women to have been called Mzana. I don't know how many of you here understand isiXhosa, but MK women have different ideas about what it means for them to be called Mzana, which literally means a small home or a small house. For someone like Modise, she says this was illustrative of how MK didn't take women seriously. But for me, I'm curious about what it means for a term that really travels mostly from boarding schools in the Eastern Cape, also in KZN. How does a term that speaks to women's place of dwelling travel to a military camp, a space that we don't understand as a space that is associated with home? What can that tell us about how the society, this world sense of these Africans, how they think about young women, as about girls and women? And the point I make is that in the African homestead, the girl and the boy, or the young woman and the young man, they have duties in terms of building the African homestead. So for me, the use of Mzana is interesting in that it tells us that African women were invited into MK to fight to liberate the national homestead, if you will. So I think that term is worth thinking through. And so I go on, I also explore the questions of torture, what happens in the camps, and that more research still needs to be done about, this period in the 1980s where some soldiers in MK were saying that they are not training to fight in the war in Angola between UNITA, against UNITA rather, but that they were pushing to come back to South Africa. That leads to a mutiny in 1984. I'm curious about women's roles in that moment of history as well. And I also, in terms of looking at one of the people that I also speak about is Ruth Mantile, who has one of the few memoirs, an MK woman who was also trained in Angola, who also fought in MK, fighting in Angola against UNITA. So I speak to her experience, that you have this combat experience in Operation Vula, but you also have these cases that are not spoken about, where MK women were active in these combat situations in Angola. Then the chapter on combative motherhood, really traces the role of women from the 1960s. I then move, focusing on the role of PAC women, because the point I make in the introduction is that women combatants complain that their role has been brushed out of history. But there are hierarchies in this erasure, in that MK women remain more visible. we still know little about women who fought for Azapo in Azanla and women who fought in Poto and Apra. So the contribution or focusing on the role of women in the 1960s is to respond to this gap. I then look at what happens in the 1980s in women in the townships. I interviewed 12 women who fought in a self-defense unit called Amabuto in Gqeberha. And, you know, I was able to reach these elders because I observed oral history workshops that Janet Cherry and Teresa Endelman were running in Gqeberha in 2012, where you had men and women in PE talking about how they understood their paramilitary actions and the fact that they saw themselves as carrying the mandate of Umkhonto weSizwe at the height of the township violence in the 1980s. That literature mostly focuses on what is known in South Africa as the Young Lions, which focuses on the role of young men. It doesn't tell us much about the role of older women and the role of young women at that time. So when I asked the men, you know, who were the women that you were with at this time, many of them led me to these older women who were hiding them in their homes, and in so doing, putting themselves at risk of routine police harassment. And some of these elder women who were part of the civic movements, both were part of the UDF as well as the Port Elizabeth Black civic organization, PEPCO. And so part of what this chapter does is to really expand MK and APLA. And that generally members of MK and APLA felt that they were swallowed into the culture of the Afrikaner National Defence Force. So a lot of them chose not to join the new South African Defence Force. But what I do is to also look at the role that was played by the ones that stayed. So I look at the role of Modise, of Nzikimemela Motumi, and J.K. Sedibe in how they worked through Parliament, through the SNDF, to make sure that the new South African Defence Force would be a space that women of a new generation would consider as a space where they can make careers. So I look at the gender transformation project that happens after 1994. Then the final chapter looks at women's personal integration, especially, what family life looks like for many of them. Some left children behind, the difficulties of finding parents, some of them were not alive, but also the material expectations that if you were in exile, you were expected to come back with all of this money. So I tried to paint this picture of what ordinary life looked like for those who had left the country, and the challenges, but also the excitement of that return. I also look at the fact that many of the women that participated inside South Africa in the self-defense unit did not have the opportunity to integrate. So generally, I make the argument that the women guerrilla, whether they were in exile or inside South Africa, they have transitioned from a life of struggle, ukuzabalaza, to a life of ukutabalaza, which is a life of hustling in South Africa's informal economy. So while you have cases where women, veterans, some are CEOs, in the case of someone like Dotsi Memela, who's the CEO of SASA, we have a couple of ambassadors. Most of them, whether they were in MK, whether they were in APLA or Wazanla or in the SDUs, the general picture is that women are left to fend for themselves. And this is similar to the experience that women across South Africa, whether they are veterans or not, are experiencing. A question has been asked about what does it mean to look at women who come from different political traditions, and to treat them in a similar way. And the argument I make is that while some MK women have more visibility than others, it is true that all women veterans, in terms of public culture and in academic literature, they are marginalized in South African historiography. And so that's why then I make the argument that it doesn't help us to create false hierarchies amongst women in terms of how they participated and how they are spoken about and theorized in democratic South Africa. But I also make the point that even if we look at the South African National Defence Force, as we can in higher education and other sectors, that we come and speak of gender equality as an idea that is acceptable is not something that happens on its own. So there's the image and the advent of Major Mandi Samvega that maybe some of you have seen, that I speak about, who was the first Black woman combat pilot. She looks like Zozibini Tunzi, this beautiful woman who says, I can fly, I can fly these combat planes. But I make the argument that a figure like her exists because of the strategic work that women who were in the liberation struggle have had to make in this area, such as the security sector reform. So the kind of sort of gender equality or gender mainstreaming that is acceptable today doesn't happen on its own. It happens because of what women learned during the armed struggle that allows them to make specific demands and claims in democratic South Africa. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Say who you are and then you.
Hi, I'm just getting my slides on. Sorry about that. I was just getting the slides up. Okay, great. So shall I start? Okay, thank you, Fazil, for this invitation. It's very nice to be back at JIAS, where I was a fellow last year. Yeah, feels so long ago. And I actually did my first book talk, but the book wasn't out. The book is out, but unfortunately, it's only available to purchase in the US. So if anyone's in the US, you can get it for under $20. I do have another book for people in the audience, which is outside, if you'd like to purchase that, and that's slightly cheaper. Very nice to be in company of Victoria and Siphokazi. And actually, Siphokazi, I mean, it's just such a coincidence, and I don't think anyone really knows this, but my first book, which was on my PhD, was about women's participation in an armed Maoist struggle in India. And actually, a lot of the women I interviewed then joined the women's movement in the 70s. And they were like a second wave, constituted a second wave of feminism in India. And it was kind of their stories that led me to this book, which I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I'm just going to start by with the motivations for writing this book. When I first started to think about the questions that went on to inform the book, I was basically finishing up as a graduate student in the UK. And there was a lot of conversation about the co-option of women's politics, which basically meant how women's movements and struggles around gender justice and gender rights were sort of changing and becoming institutionalized, if you want. So in the global north, they took the form of the rise of women's studies in the university. And there were sort of concerns about what that meant in terms of the professionalization of women's issues and a kind of gulf between the ivory tower of the university, if you want, and women's struggles on the ground. In the global south, they took quite a different tone, these kind of conversations around co-option. And they centered around the rise of a new organizational form, which was the non-governmental organization, or the NGO. Oops. Here we go. And I always use this quote by the writer and activist Srila Roy, because I think it really captures some of the anxieties around what she calls the NGOization of politics, and how it, renders politics as a payable job and not something that you do motivated by passion and so on and so forth. So elsewhere in the global south, in India, where the book is located, NGOs basically transform the face of women's rights organizing. So while in the period of the 70s, women's organizing was basically led by non-political party, non-funded, very grassroots, organic women's groups. From the 1990s, what you see is the transformation of those groups into professionalized, funded organizations, or indeed the rise of a whole new set of organizations working around gender justice. And these developments were basically a direct consequence of what we call the liberalization of the Indian economy, so just globalization in brief. So globalization opens up the prospect of transnational, international funds, which come into the development sector. Now, while fears around the co-option of feminist struggles were kind of pervasive across the global south and the global north, the Indian case raised some additional complexities, which was basically to do with sexuality. So India's liberalization coincided with the global rise of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And for those of you who don't know, India was positioned as being the next, after the African continent, as being at the next at-risk locale. And what that meant was a lot of money came into the country to mobilize around HIV/AIDS. And much of that money targeted at-risk communities like sex workers, men who have sex with men, and so on and so forth. But basically, to cut a long story short, what this moment did is it had an unexpected opening where sexuality and questions of sexual rights were raised and mobilized around for the first time. And even the very recent decriminalization of homosexuality, which only happened in 2018 in India, can be traced to this original moment and opening created inadvertently by globalization. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to suggest is that in the case of India, the kind of anxieties around co-option and NGOization were not so straightforward. So in 2009, I undertook a pilot study which preceded the research for the actual book. And what I basically did is I talked to feminist and queer activists, academics across 3 major cities in India. And I was very interested in the generational dimension around NGOs. So I was very interested in what older generations of feminists thought who had not worked professionally or in these settings. And their responses were very much like Srila Roy. They were very skeptical of the transformations in political cultures. But a lot of women of my own generation, in fact, like some of us have gone into academia and many had gone into the NGO sector, really didn't have a problem with combining a salary with doing work around social justice. And a queer activist that I met in Delhi said, you let loose an idea that is beyond your control, everything gets co-opted. So the book essentially locates itself in this struggle between being co-opted or caught on the one hand and between being free or autonomous on the other hand, to offer a different way to think of feminism's entanglement in power, especially in a conjuncture shaped by global neoliberalism. So just to give you a flavor of some of the conceptual arguments that the book makes, unlike arguments that tend to divide feminist struggles into ones that are co-opted and ones that are not, feminism, I suggest in the book, is always co-opted. It's never outside of power. And the book tries to think about feminism as a form of governance, so as a way of governing society and as a way of governing the self, or what I call, after the French philosopher Foucault, a governmentality in the broadest possible sense. Secondly, and relatedly, the book understands feminism as constituting the conditions for the making of the self, acting as a technology of the self. It shows how feminism affords the tools to craft a new kind of self and a new way of life. And it suggests tentatively that it is perhaps to the scale of the self that we ought to turn to sense its radical potential. So as a technology of both governance and of the self, feminism is always already co-opted, as I said, never outside of the imbrication of power. And yet it is this entanglement and imbrication in power that enables feminism to become a creative and transformative force in the world. So the book shows how feminist and queer feminist organizing, if you're interested, I can talk much more about the relationship between the queer and non-queer feminist in the Indian context. So queer and feminist organizing in India is inextricably entangled in different governing logics, as well as in layered histories of activism and normativities. And here what the book tries to do is push against overestimations of the impact of neoliberalism by tracing longer shifts in the logics and techniques of governing gendered, racialized, and sexualized subjects, especially in the global south, as well as the complex lineages. And I think in this case, it sort of speaks to your work on different political traditions. So the different lineages and political traditions which constitute feminist thought and practice in the specific context of post-colonial India. And these together comprise a history of contemporary queer and non-queer Indian feminism. My ethnographic site was the eastern state, is the eastern state of West Bengal, which lent quite nicely to a study of mixed political lineages and genealogies. The state is quite unique. It had a history of, an uninterrupted history of 34 years of communist rule. So in this context, the book focuses on 2 self-identified feminist organizations, a queer feminist organization, which had a history that very much mirrored a previous generation of women's rights organizing, in that it started as a small support group for mostly, but not only, cisgender lesbian women, and has gone on to become quite a well-established NGO working on sexual rights. The other organization, which works much more in the rural areas rather than in the urban areas, is representative of those NGOs that came into being after the UN Decade for Women ended with the Beijing Conference in 1995. And these organizations were often locally known as Beijing Babies. And this organization uses quite mainstream development strategies like microfinance, which is the giving and taking of small loans for women, with women's rights and empowerment. So the activities and self-understandings of both organizations were shaped by, I suggest, logics and governmentalities, which were not just transnational, but were highly local. So they were leftist or nationalist or statist. But the book also shows how these queer and non-queer feminist spaces engender in turn their own forms of governmentality and techniques of the self. So for instance, I show how both organizations were highly invested in speaking on behalf of the rural poor as a way of consolidating their own authenticity and relevance, and of course, accessing funds for NGO work. So on the one hand, we have politicized queers who speak on behalf of apolitical rural lesbians, and metropolitan development workers who try and speak on behalf of and intervene into the lives of poor rural women. And this modality of speaking on behalf of is a direct legacy of the Indian women's movement, whose middle-class, upper-caste constituencies would generally try and speak on behalf of their poor sisters elsewhere. And of course, it is deeply reminiscent of the way in which imperial feminists have spoken on behalf of colonized women in the rest of the world. And these are the dynamics that continue to shape, and I use the word haunt in the book, contemporary feminist formations, whether queer or non-queer. And these were also the dynamics of reproducing rather than challenging historical exclusions and inequalities, especially along the lines of class, caste, and respectability politics. They made for what I call a limited intersectionality, where individuals, for instance, were openly queer, but were in the closet when it came to other aspects of themselves, like caste and class. And where organizations found it safe to talk about questions of gender and sexuality, but not about religion or caste in the Indian context. Yet, despite these sort of complexities, if you want, the book also shows how new forms of selfhood were crafted within these spaces. I mean, it's kind of important to flag that the organizations really did work on transforming the self through a whole range of pedagogies and tools like consciousness raising, gender trainings, workshops on self-empowerment. So their real site of intervention was the individual self. And in doing so, they inadvertently or intentionally nurtured rich projects of self and world making. So my interviewees, from rural development workers to middle-class queer feminist activists, were active instruments of what I call a queer feminist governmentality, incited to empower the self for governing and empowering others. And yet these emancipatory pedagogies and tools were much more about caring for the self than they were about caring for or empowering others, which I'll come back to. So ultimately, the book tells a story of the making of queer feminist governments, subjects themselves in a specific time and place in global capitalism. It provides an account of some of the new non-state arts and technologies of governance that emerged in India as constituting the conditions for individuals to make themselves in a novel fashion. So the book tells two stories at once of government and self-government, and the book's structure kind of reflects that. And that's the table of contents, which I don't know if you can see. How much time do I have? I just thought I'll do just very briefly. Yeah, I'll just run through the chapters. So the first two chapters, the introduction and chapter 1, make a case for turning from this idea of co-option to entanglement. Entanglement, I suggest, after people like Sarah Nuttall, who's my colleague at WITS. And thank you, colleagues from WITS who have attended. Entanglement, I suggest, offers a way of grappling head-on with the contradictions and tensions of the moment, while reminding us that feminism's proximity to power is not newly experienced in the global south. So rather than neoliberal co-option, I argue that feminism in India and arguably everywhere has been entangled in power relations, both historic and ongoing. The chapters that follow present the ethnography, which constitutes the core of the book. So I start in chapter 2 with the story of Sanford for Equality, which, as I said, began with as a support group for lesbian women called Sappho, when the controversy around the film Fire, which is considered India's first lesbian film, exploded in 1998. Since then, Sappho has seen a rapid rise, becoming a well-funded and quite prominent NGO working on sexual rights and more recently on trans rights. So the journey from Sappho to Sappho for Equality, which the chapter kind of maps, marks many developments, such as the turn from actual spaces of support to virtual ones, the organization's interaction with other lesbian groups in the city, and more recently with trans feminist organizations, which were mostly comprised of low-caste trans women. And the conditions that institutionalized activism, whether that's globalization, new digital technologies, the urban neoliberal economy, also created, I suggest, new regimes of normalization and regulation in which older forms of hierarchies and exclusions endured. And this is perhaps best summarized by a trans feminist activist who said of the Sappho for Equality activists, and I quote, "They keep looking for the grassroots and the Dalit." Dalit is a politicized term for former untouchables in India. So they keep looking for the grassroots and for the Dalit, and here we are right in front of them. The chapter ends, however, by noting that trans and queer feminisms are equally mired in normative ideas of Indian feminism. And the question of who could most represent the sexual subaltern constituted a source of competition, even conflict amongst them. As a foil to this story of queer activism, I present in chapter 3, queerness as a way of making life and self in the capital city of Kolkata, the capital of the state. A moment of unprecedented queer activism and visibility, given how the Indian courts, which some of you will know, may not know, they decriminalized and recriminalized and finally decriminalized homosexuality. So this kind of changing terrain produced new possibilities for queer people, particularly in cities. Queer members of Sappho for Equality, both cisgender and transgender, were some of the first to live openly out of the closet. But who chose to came out of the closet and under what conditions? And that's what the chapter is really about, revealed sharply intersectional questions. And I opened this chapter with this screenshot from a lesbian advert, which really exemplifies some of these complexities. So very much in brief, the chapter shows a couple, a lesbian couple. Anyway, plot aside, what's really interesting about the advert is how it's the aesthetic of the advert, like how it's styled. So there's like an antique wooden table, there's a poster of clockwork orange. So it's the perfect Indian, modern or global Indian, right? So I use the advert to talk about how, again, metropolitan location, class, caste, the English language, all of those are the conditions through which one can actually exit the closet. And ultimately, I end the chapter by talking about one of my interviewees who's a Dalit Sappho for Equality activist who was out as gay, but not as Dalit. And so I asked the question of, what does it mean to be in contemporary India today, where it's safer to be out as gay, but not as low caste, right? So from queer governmentality, the book turns to feminist governmentality, which I revealed to be a very complex terrain of developing subaltern women, informed by everything from regional feminism, state developmentalism, and global efforts to render neoliberal development commensurate with women's rights. In the case of Janam, the other organization, these efforts were fraught with contradictions and tensions insofar as neoliberal assumptions around women's access to credit were fundamentally incommensurate with feminist aspirations to uphold their rights. And the resolution of these incompatible ends produced unequal regulatory and even at times coercive practices on the part of quite well-intentioned NGO workers. The objects of development interventions, poor, rural, low-caste women, brought these incommensurable agendas to a head. And towards the end of the chapter, I show how women rejected the NGO's efforts to save them, constituting the kind of limits of this sort of feminist developmentalism, and even showing how they fail. But the women I interviewed were also exemplary in a different way, which is that, or rather the NGO was quite typical in different ways, that they used rural development workers not only as the objects of their development interventions, but also as the actual deliverers of development. So NGOs today very commonly use rural women who they train to go back into the community and do a range of interventions like, you know, raise consciousness or educate local rural women around. In this case, it was everything about GBV, child marriage, women's education, and so on and so forth. And what I argue in this penultimate chapter is that it was these women, and there's an image from the ethnographic site and a quote from one of the women. It was these women who were considered volunteers and not employees of the organization who stood most empowered, in contrast to who the NGOs actually thought of as their beneficiaries. I show how in the intimate lives of rural development workers, this thing called empowerment translated into a whole range of things, forms of individualism, new forms of intersubjectivity, conjugality, consumption, care, even joy, fun, and friendship. And their narratives enabled a central claim of the book that development and activist spaces are potentially far more productive for individuals to work on, care for, and transform the self than they are to care for and empower the other, which is often a project that's ridden with friction and failure. Finally, in the book's conclusion, I reflect on the purpose of feminist critique. So what does it mean to produce critique, especially by feminist academics, on feminist activists, especially in a time where India is facing an authoritarian right-wing government? So I try and offer a more expansive role for the critic, as one who practices critique as a form of letting go of demands of purity and untainted freedom to care for the self and the world. Indeed, contemporary India offers many moments to let go and to begin anew. And in this conclusionary chapter, I'll turn very briefly to some recent protests. I mean, I say recent now, but this is sort of end 2019, beginning 2020, which were against the authoritarian politics of the Indian government. And this is an image from the protest, which says affection as resistance. And Isabel Roy has written quite a bit about it, and I'm happy to share that. So these are merely some of the diverse, incomplete, and fundamentally contradictory ways in which feminist subjects are made and are making themselves in times of upheaval and crisis. This is also where the work of feminist academics might begin, in assumptions of impurity, messiness, and entanglement, rather than in purity, cleanliness, and freedom. For feminists in India and elsewhere, this might mean staying with the uncertainty and the ambivalence of projects of self and world-making, rather than accepting the closure of co-option as a way of maintaining our own attachments to proper feminist subjects and to desirable subjects.
Thank you, Srila. Now I would like to invite everybody to share your thoughts or questions with us. So you can type into the chat box and I can read from there, or you can just ask your question and share your thoughts yourself. And to everyone here in the room as well. If there is an immediate question to anyone of the speakers.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Fazil, can I ask a question?
Okay.
Oh, does someone else have a question?
Yeah. Just hold a second and then.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Dilip Menon. I'm a historian at the University of Pakistan here. This is a question for Victoria. I was wondering how far is it possible to write an indigenous or an eminent history of the Guatemalan state in this period, because beginning with the CIA intervention in 1954, which brings in a authoritarian government, displaces the existing government. And the United States of America's continued support for military dictatorships till the 1990s. And you had civil society and left-wing movements fighting against that. So you have one generation or more of American intervention ensures military dictatorship and a consequent patriarchy. Right? I mean, military dictatorships are not known for their liberal values. So in that sense, what I missed in your answer was the fact that Guatemala could have been different, right? Had there not been this American intervention. And so the comment, that's the question. The comment is really that after the 1990s, with increasing American involvement in the Middle East, their stranglehold on South America decreases, and suddenly you have the rise of indigenous movements, feminist movements, movements for democracy. So I think one can't take the history of Guatemala in isolation. The entire history of South America is a history of American imposition of dictatorships.
Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Okay.
Just go ahead.
Any for Prof. Siphokazi Magadla, thank you very much for the presentation. For me, it was just a thought I wanted to share because we were mentioning things that resonate with what happens in Zimbabwe, whereby I was writing down that I would be gone by the time I had to. I was going to meet this comment. I was saying in Zimbabwe, while we have the Zimbabwe National Liberation War Veterans Association, with about 30,000 registered beneficiaries of the government. Lately, in the past maybe 10 years, we've had an outcry from women war veterans who are saying they are not part of it because the way the parameters are set for people to become part of this registration, they are not fitting in because they do not go out in combat. They participated. And they're saying we are women liberation veterans, but we do not go onto the field for combat. So now just recently in Zimbabwe, I think in the past 2 years, they're now doing what's called the War Collaborators Association. And some are still disgruntled, saying, no, if I did not hold the AK-47, it does not mean that I did not bring the independence. This is mostly women. But until today, 2023, it's just war collaborators. So they are being vetted so that they fit into this payout and are also recognized. So it actually spoke volumes to me because part of the older women in my family are now being vetted so that they fit into it. But then there's still a lot of outcry because they want, it's based mostly on oral history for you to fit in because there's no record that you went and fought or you supported this. But it's actually interesting that women have to find special ways for them to be recognized and fit in. And now they're being told, you're not going to be called veterans, you're going to be called collaborators because you don't fit in. But if the majority of women who participated in the liberation war for independence until 1980, they still don't fit in because they didn't go in full combat. So it's quite interesting. I thought this is something that you might find interesting.
Yeah, I don't see anyone who has raised hand or tapped questions. So, Victoria, do you hear me? You need to unmute.
Yeah. I had
You can ask the question and then respond to Prof. Menon's thought. And then we have a question from Sandra, which follows from you. Go ahead.
Okay.
Or shall we take Sandra's question as well? Sorry. Shall we take Sandra's questions before you start?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Sandra, if you hear me, please go ahead and share your thought.
Mine is more of a comment and contribution than a question regarding the presentation on women's combatants in South Africa. I think from the previous speaker, I'm hearing sort of a narrative that yes, there is a section of Zimbabwean women who are saying we didn't go for, for the front line. We didn't fight, right? That's one section. But there are Zimbabwean women who fought on the front line. And what has happened with Zimbabwean history regarding the role of women in the liberation struggle is what is problematic. And it is what we are grappling with in terms of how, as feminist scholars, we can rewrite history in the Zimbabwean context so that we can represent the truth. Norma Krieger managed to do something. If you read Leon's work on guns and guerrilla girls, she also narrated how women participated in the liberation struggle as fighters. But there was some silence that then happened after independence, because the post-colonial state was not prepared to honor their promises. When they were fighting in the trenches, they were talking about equality. They were talking about, leaning to the left, the Marxist-Leninist, ideology will create an equal society. But after independence, women are wiped out, in terms of where they are in political spaces, where they are in economic spaces, even in negotiating the Unity Accord in 1987, you don't see women. So I don't really believe that, these concerns are really about women not saying we didn't fight, but let's probably take an intersectionalist approach to these women and see women who were in rural areas who cooked for these, male fighters, but women who went on the front line. And if you read Norma Krieger's work, the slogan that was there, I think drawing parallels to what was presented in South Africa. How did that term travel from boarding schools to represent a domesticated space for women? This is what happened. Even during the Liberation War, the narrative, the slogan was forward with the cooking stick. And this was brought home after the war, forward with the cooking stick, to demobilize women so that they don't rise after 1980 when we won independence to demand, a lot of, issues, because they were fighting two patriarchs, the British and African patriarch at the same time, and they deserved to be treated in a different manner, and that's what they expected. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Sandra. Victoria?
I'll just respond briefly. I couldn't hear everything that was said in that question because someone else had their speaker on somewhere, so it was a little bit garbled, but I got the general drift of it, and I absolutely agree that the connections and the violence and the coup, when the coup happened in Guatemala, the U.S. also supported a coup in Iran. So this history of CIA involvement runs really deep. And in fact, I mean, they're really, one of the things that struck me when you were speaking was there was an interview that a U.S. journalist, Elizabeth Farnsworth, did in the Ishil area, which was one of the areas that was hit extraordinarily hard during the genocide. And she was interviewing a Guatemalan captain, and he had red hair. And he spoke English, but it was an unusual accent. And she said, "Oh, you speak English?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, I can't quite place your accent. And he said, "Oh, well, that's because I was trained in Argentina." So he proceeds to tell her that he was trained in Argentina for 2 years. And that, so at the time he's trained in Argentina is during the Dirty War in Argentina. And then where does he go from Argentina? He goes to South Africa, and he was with the South African army fighting against SWAPO for a year or two. And that's what the accent was that she was picking up. So like these ties that circulate through in the militaries are ties that are connected through the School of the Americas and different alliances that the United States has made at different moments to move military hardware or military support to different countries. In the case of Guatemala, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was a ban on US military aid by the Congress, but aid didn't stop going to Guatemala. The CIA ran weapons to Guatemala through the Israeli army. So if you look at private security companies in Guatemala today, the two largest private security companies are Wackenhut, which is former CIA, and Golan Security, which is former Israeli intelligence. So like these international connections that travel through aren't particular to Guatemala. I absolutely agree. At the same time, the indigenous movements, indigenous people have been resisting since the first arrival of the Spaniards. There's a beautiful book by Severo Martinez that's called Motines de Indios, Indian Mutinies. And it's this deep historical research that he did in the late 1970s about all the different mutinies that indigenous people carried out to try to break the shackles of the basic imprisonment that they were living under in their own lands. And those movements continued to build. And in the late 1970s in Guatemala, there were significant indigenous movements. There were significant movements of workers. And in fact, at the very time that the first massacre in 1978 happened was when there was a mass movement moving through the streets. So the movement that we see right now of indigenous communities walking down to the capital from the highlands has happened before. But this time it's happening en masse, and it's also happening with participation from all sectors of society. So it's not only indigenous people, it's all Guatemalans who don't support the oligarchy. And people are really sick of corruption. But I also think your point about international influence is really important. You know, a lot of funding has been cut off to NGOs in Guatemala over the last year. And one of the indigenous organizations that I know and work with in Guatemala, their funding was cut, and their funder, which was a Scandinavian organization, I don't remember which country, but it was one of the Scandinavian supporters. They said, we're really sorry, but we have to give all of our assistance now to Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine has taken over. So there has been this withdrawal of external funding, and the UN has not been in Guatemala really very much at all since the CICIG was kicked out by the government. At the same time, you know, if you look at the images that are on social media that show all the different groups of people who are out protesting, many of these indigenous organizations are related to communities of populations and resistance, which were groups of people who survived the massacres but lived in flight from the army for years before the peace accords were signed. So I think those are interesting, and also that they have moved cases through the domestic courts against military officers for crimes against humanity, for sexual slavery, and for genocide. And those cases are ongoing, as well as disappearances. Those cases are still continuing in domestic courts, which is why there's been this incredible effort made by the oligarchy, by elites, by the so-called dark forces in Guatemala to co-opt the judicial system, because the only way they can maintain impunity is if there is no justice. But I wanted to thank the other two speakers, because I thought the presentations were so spectacular. And Dr. Magadla, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what the post, like what was the integration of these former women who were combatants into the government? Like to what degree were they included in the process? Because I know in Colombia and in Guatemala, the women were basically excluded. I mean, in Colombia, when the M19 demobilized, the men were given resources, and the assumption was, well, women are with men, so they can just get resources through their man, basically. So I think there have been some changes over time, but I'd be interested to know about that. And I just thought the testimonies that you shared were really beautiful and moving. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues. I'll start with the question about from Titi, you know, I really received that there's so many parallels. And I mean, in Southern Africa, I think most of the books that we do have are actually about women in Zimbabwe, you know. Tanya Lowen's one, and one of the more recent ones is by Eleanor O'Gorman. It's called "The Frontline Runs Through Every Woman," and she focuses on women in the rural area, because with Lowen's one, still the women that are formally trained. But even with her, she makes the point that, it's really with the release of Flame, in 95, that there's a public conversation about women's experiences. And one of the things I try to make clear is that actually time is important. So what we see in South Africa, which I think is similar, even in Zimbabwe, even with how the story of Joyce Mujuru's role, changes over time, is that in South Africa, it feels to me that there's only one way in which women guerrillas can speak about their experience. And I argue that it is around talking about whether or not one experienced sexual violence. There's a lot of pressure to speak about that to an extent where it seems as if one didn't experience it, maybe they may be not telling the truth. And one of the things I try to do when I say it's important to look at the time that women enter from the 70s to the 80s, because a lot of the women, so if I look at Faba, Kulati, but the number of women that I spoke to, they say by the time they came into the camps in the 1980s, the women in the 1970s had raised the questions on their behalf. So one could be in a camp, 5 women and 500 men, and not experience and not be harassed. But there are also cases of harassment. So both things are true. I mean, even there's an interview by Minister Lindiwe Zulu that I quote, where she says, people like Mapisa Ngakula had already been there, So she acknowledges the role played by the pioneers, which made the camp a safer space, where you had a rule that senior men, a rule called Rule 25, where men in leadership could not have relationships with new women recruits. But even Lindiwe Zulu says, in fact, in her relationship with her husband, she defied that rule because that's where she met him in the camp. But there were these systematic changes that come as a result of what women do. And so I take people like Mushodi, Ambassador Mushodi, talk about what it meant to have panties, pads in the camps, making it normal that there's regular access to sanitary towels, for instance. So they suffer. Modise talks about this as well, but this changes by the 1980s because of what women do in the 1970s. But this case of Ruth Mandile, for instance, is so interesting for me. And I love this cover of this book because it's one of the few cases of a former MK woman who does talk about the fact that she was raped 4 times. In Bloemfontein, she's raped the first day she arrives in Maseru. She's raped in Vienna, in Angola as well. And she speaks about it quite openly. And the fact that she gets pregnant as a result, and what the ANC does to the perpetrator, because the perpetrator was sent to Quatro, which was the ANC camp where someone who was accused of being an infiltrator or accused of rape, they were sent to that camp. And even that experience shows the extent to which there was a recognition of rape as a serious offense. So I wanted to make that point. But then, the point around women being vetted. Oh, in fact, this is a big question around the definition of combat. So I align myself with the work of people like Raymond Sadner and Janet Cherry, who say, even the definition of combat in a guerrilla context is not, it's not conventional. There are very few cases of successful infiltration of MK guerrillas to South Africa. So the case of Modise and even of Solomon Mahlangu in the 1970s, those are rare cases. The majority of guerrillas, whether they are women or men, were not successfully infiltrated. So some of the arguments now when we talk about who's benefiting, in terms of getting pensions, some people who remained in the townships, they say, well, you might have been trained, but we faced the SADF in the townships. You didn't enter into a direct battle. But again, in a guerrilla battle, what does it mean for us to hold that certain very stable idea of what combat is? And so for me, I think it's important to challenge that, because what it does is that then we face the risk of only looking at MK women and ignoring the rest. So when I look at combative motherhood, and here I try to get into those big debates about maternal politics in South Africa, but what I really try to show with the experiences of women in the 60s and 80s is to show that the figure of Madikizela Mandela is not an exception. Her figure was normal in South Africa in terms of how women, old and young, participated in the armed struggle. In fact, it is the figure of the MK woman that can be argued to be an exception, because fewer women could leave the country and could be in the camps. But then what happens in, talking about vetting? So I tell a story of Makosaza Natraba, who goes to military veterans to be vetted as a combatant. And she talks about how she was asked to describe the conditions in the camps, the kinds of trees that were in Pango. She says, I have worked very hard to forget that life. What does it mean for me to be asked many years later to prove that I was there by being able to remember that difficult period, when we know that part of underground life is being able to forget, is being able to undermine who you are. This is the work by Sandra, So even those that were trained, there is this pressure to be vetted, a pressure that I think is only really expected of women. In Congo, there's a similar case. Did you use an AK-47? The fact of the matter is most of the combatants didn't. That is a fact. And so it's an expectation. So the point I make, looking at Tsotsi Mamela's role in Operation Vula, similar to Sana, is to make the point that without her role doing reconnaissance for Nyanda and Maharaj, that operation would not have been possible. So what does it mean for us to say Nyanda and Maharaj are the combatants and not to look at her as a combatant? She also tells a story in the book where when she's applying for her military veterans pensions, she is told about her ex-husband. She says, but I didn't go to exile. I didn't follow my husband. I met him there. He had nothing to do with me being there. That we met there was not my reason of going there. So even with women who left the country, received training, the criteria of proving that they are combatants is much longer, is a higher expectation than men, which is why many of them still do not benefit in terms of these veterans' pensions by the DMV. And then finally, the question by Victoria, maybe in some ways, I have responded to this question around integration. I mean, maybe you know the literature around the Women's Coalition in South Africa, that even during the negotiation period, women had to come together across political parties and formations to make sure that women were present in the negotiations. So there was no guarantee that women, even gender equality, would be codified. And what I do by looking at what happens in the South African National Defence Force is to also show that in the absence of figures, okay, I'm not sure who was that, in the absence of figures of women in the SNDF, in fact, there would not have been a guarantee that gender mainstreaming would have been accepted. So I made the example about someone like Major Mveka. One of the things Motumi and Modise point out is that women in camps had to wear the military uniform designed for men, shoes designed for men. So what they do after 94 is to make sure that changes, that you have a gender-friendly uniform, you have even the infrastructure of the SNDF is gender-friendly. So that's why I make the point that this success that is celebrated should be historicized in terms of the role that women in the liberation movement played in ensuring that. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions online. I don't know if someone here is, yeah.
I haven't quite formulated the question, but it's interesting to me that all the presentations do not in any way refer to patriarchy. That they, they immediately jump into, the issue of women, because the women combatants and the queer women, etc., they come from a society, and I have a feeling that what the manner in which we view, or the manner in which we understand these women, is dictated to a large extent by the society that they come from. Because, the studies actually are very important, because I think in reality, we have the kind of attitude now that people probably don't even know or care about the role that women played. Even in the Zimbabwean case, before we got our freedom, the articles that were written about former women combatants were mainly lamenting the fact that they are not being accepted as women by the society, that they have lost their woman, hood by playing the role of men. So, what I'm trying to say is that the studies are good. I understand what's going on, but somehow I don't think that they are reflected against the present reality in terms of how women are viewed by society.
Okay, go on.
Thanks very much to all the speakers for engaging presentations. A question for Siphokazi and then one for Srila. Two quick questions for you. I was just interested whether the NK, the ANC, the other liberation political organizations had any official sort of policy, something down on paper, in terms of how to handle sexual and gendered violence in the camps, or was it kind of treated on a more ad hoc basis? And then also, have you come across any testimonies or stories or accounts of men experiencing sexual violence in the camps? And then for Srila, you mentioned that it was really globalization, the opening up of the liberalization of the Indian economy that leads to, and of course sort of coinciding with the HIV crisis, leading to this influx of funds into India, and then this sort of provides this sort of financial basis for kind of professional careers in activism in the NGO sector. And I just wondered, with we've heard a lot about with the current government in India kind of closing up of donor funding, making it much harder for donors to kind of come in, and this has led to the sort of retreat of certain large donors, whether this withdrawal of funds and the lack of funding is going to then lead to a kind of recalibration or a reconfiguring of political activism.
So I was just thinking if all the three of you can just engage what Barbara raised, the comment, or a critique indeed, and then and the two of you can respond to the latest questions raised. We started.
I was hoping not to be the one to go first.
Okay, I can go first. Yeah, sure. So patriarchy actually features quite a lot in the actual book, because both the organizations that I look at use explicitly the concept and the word patriarchy when they're talking about their kind of intervention. So for instance, with queer women, so organizations will talk about patriarchy in terms of how families not just stigmatize, but actually punish their daughters when they find out they're queer, trying to get them forcibly married and or make them go through psychiatric tests, etc., and all of that. And so the organization theorizes that in terms of patriarchy, as a patriarchal violence, not just a homophobic violence, because of the specific patriarchal structures in the context of India, for instance, right? The other organization, the Rural Development Organization, also uses patriarchy very directly in their language. So you can even have a vernacular term for it. And often the way in which they understand it and mobilize it is very much harkens back to a leftist tradition. So to talk about how, women don't earn, women don't have ownership, women don't have property, women don't have livelihoods, and that makes them dependent on men. So, and what does that dependency do? So a lot of the gender training that I observed or try and talk, where the organization or NGO workers would talk to rural women, it would directly try and do this kind of consciousness raising to say, okay, your husband works in a factory, earns so much. What if the factory closes, he doesn't have a job? What will that mean for you? Blah, blah, blah. And those are, for me, very much about a 34-year-long communist rule. That's the language of socialist feminism, actually. So it's really interesting to see how just one concept in one terrain travels quite, relatedly, but also distinctly. And Annie, thank you. So, sorry, what was the question again about? Yes, how the recalibration. Yeah. So, by the time I came to the end of the book, obviously West Bengal has saved me, as you know, because it's not a BJP state, right? Although, as we know, the BJP has made significant inroads. But when I was doing the research, much less so. So I feel like this book would be really different if it was in UP, for instance, or somewhere where the BJP is dominant. But by the time I came to the end of the book, it was impossible to not, of course, I do talk about Hindu nationalism through, but it was impossible to not talk about precisely what you're saying about the shrinking of civil society, right? And what is it then, as I said, what does it mean to produce critique of NGO work or civil society organizing when civil society is actually under so much threat, right? But I think your question is more an empirical one. Do we see the recasting of civil society? I think we do in enormously productive ways, actually. So I think the fact that the category of the Muslim woman has become has such power to actually rechange political terrains. If we think of what happened in Shaheen Bagh, so the whole public is being recast around the figure of the Muslim woman, who's obviously always been Islamophobically rendered in the Hindu/Indian majority imagination, right? So then the figure of the student, the student who's jailed, so the political prisoner. So I think, of course, on the one hand, yes, there's the pulling back on Greenpeace, Ford Foundation, all of those on the chopping block. But I think there's also a lot of productive things happening in terms of the civil society, and that's where we have to really watch and see what happens. Thank you.
I was just also wondering if you could just say a little bit about the hierarchy within these two NGOs and the issue of caste and class, as you also did.
Oh, okay.
Discuss. If you can just
yeah, sure. Both the organizations are, the main staff, if you want, even though it's hard to say that about the queer feminist organization because it's much more activist. So it doesn't really have staff. It's more like volunteers who, they have more staff. But in any case, but you would say that both organizations, the face of it is much more metropolitan, middle class, upper caste, cisgender women, in a nutshell, which very much follows the profile of previous generations of feminist organizing.
So are there Dalit women? So
So when I was doing the research, no one was really talking about caste, and so the interviewee who revealed she was Dalit to me, but she wasn't openly Dalit in the organization. But this is in the queer feminist organization. But subsequently, there's been actually a lot about caste in queer politics in India, right? So there's been entire pride marches in Delhi where caste has become the major issue around which queer politics has been thought of as needing to reconstitute itself. And within the life of this organization, I see more recently on social media that there's been a lot of talking around the intersections of caste and sexuality, and the person who spoke to me is now openly out as lower caste.
Could I add to that?
Sure.
It's so interesting to me when you're speaking about the advert.
Yes.
Because in South Africa, and colleagues can correct me here, it's so striking to me that in public culture, I mean, we have so many telenovelas, and a lot of those, if you have queer presentation characters, it's men. I'm not sure if there's any mainstream TV show that has two women at this very moment. The only one I remember that had established characters was Society, years ago. So it's really interesting that in India there's some level of public representation, if you will.
But that was also why, like, that advert was online and it went viral because it was lesbian and not gay men.
Okay, you can just continue.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Masekela. This question reminds me of a conversation that happened at the WITS conference on the politics of the armed struggle in 2016. I used that quote in the book where there's a young woman was a florist asking as a panel with Makosaza Maklaba, Mtito, and Satna, chaired by Judy Segman, and she asked them, what kind of feminist were you when you left? Would you describe yourselves as having been radical feminists? Because in fact, she was describing herself as a radical feminist. And in a long question, she implies that the MK women were in fact patriarchal princesses. So they allowed things to happen. And all of them, in their own way, they make the point, and Mushote says this, he says, our feminism was built in this situation. They explain that we came from the society. What happens in the camps reflects where we come from and where we find ourselves. So I do speak about patriarchy explicitly. I regret that it didn't come out so explicitly today. But really the point is to say, when I look at the term Mzana, is to say, how does this society imagine men and women? Because I'm so interested by the some of the work that has been done around, for instance, circumcision in Robben Island. There is a veteran, I think he said he did about 166 circumcisions in Robben Island alone, and most of these from men from the Eastern Cape. And the point, what I find interesting about that for me is that even in the context of struggle, these young men who become men still wanted to be seen as men in a very specifically culturally defined way. And the point is made, I think, is it in the Northwest, I forget, in Satna's work, where some young men were told they won't go for circumcision. In fact, joining MK, they would become men. So I then, in teasing out what it meant for women who grow up, most of them in a society where they are raised to be industrious, to be industrious, what does it mean for us to think that when the turn to the armed struggle happens, what does it mean for us to think that they wouldn't be industrious in the fight for national liberation? And so that's how I try to think about patriarchy from the world sense of where most of these women guerrillas come from. It is to paint us the specific textures of how the society imagines men and women. And then the point that Annie about sexual, how does sexual, what are the policies? So I speak about the MK Code of Conduct is explicitly against sexual harassment or rape. And in fact, as I show in the case of Mandile, there was a follow-up in some cases where people were jailed, some tortured because of rape. But I don't know if it's any case of an MK man who speaks openly about sexual harassment. A lot of what I see are mostly men talking about having experience of torture, for instance, in Kwantu. So there's a lot of that. There's more memoirs about that, not so much about harassment. Yes, thank you.
And Victoria, we have about 5 minutes left, so I wonder if you can share your thoughts with us regarding the questions that were raised.
Sure, I'd like to share them briefly because I wanted to ask Dr. Magadla another question. So no, I think also in my book, I think that probably the three of us are all trying to share what we thought are salient points of what our work was about. And I think I was more focused on looking at what the current the state of the national strike and uprising in Guatemala is. But what my book is definitely grounded in histories of patriarchy, militarism, discrimination, and violence, and understanding that in a long arc of structures of violence in Guatemala, and that in fact the corruption and the structural violence that exists because of structural inequality. Guatemala is not a poor country. It's actually a pretty wealthy country. It has the highest level of inequality in the Americas, except for Haiti. But unlike Haiti, it's not a poor country. And that's why the structures exist the way that they do, with such great corruption, backed up and supported by violence, and the patriarchy and the militarism that existed during the genocide, that existed during the overthrow, that pre-existed the 1954 coup, that has to do with discrimination and trying to contain a majority indigenous population and keep them enslaved, has a lot to do with it. And in my book, it's not just limited to Guatemala, it connects back to the relationship with the United States, which is why migration is also part of the story. There are stories of different women who fled Guatemala because of gender violence, and it shows on the one hand what happened in Guatemala, whether it was the medical system, the police, the prosecutors, the court who failed them, but also what their experience was coming to the US. And the reason that that's important, in this country of 330 some million people, we have 11 million people living here who are undocumented. We haven't had immigration reform since Ronald Reagan was president in like 1980. And so all of these people are forced to live in the shadows, and the numbers are pretty stunning. I mean, there are 724,000 Guatemalans, 741,000 Salvadorans, 490,000 Hondurans, and those people who are living in this country, some of them came fleeing the wars in the 1980s. Their children are legal citizens, but they're not. And then others who've come more recently are fleeing violence that is the product of the kind of a transformation of the previous military structures that have now been co-opted by cartels and organized crime. But my question for Dr. Magadla, I think they're quick ones, is I'm curious what the percentage was roughly of women combatants to male combatants over time. And then also if there were any women commanders in rural or urban areas. Thank you. I'm so interested in your work. I have about 100 questions for you, but I'll limit it to those two because we're running out of time. I hope we can continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. Jacqueline Koch estimates the figures. It's about 15%, but it's so difficult to know for sure. But I mean, in my interviews, it was clear that there's no case where women were the majority in a camp. They were always in small numbers, even as their numbers increased from the 70s. So that's the estimation that is repeated, around 15%, but I mean, it's difficult to know how one arrives at that figure. And then I don't think I have a figure in terms of the women in leadership. So for instance, Major General J.K. Sedibe was the highest ranked woman in MK, who becomes the highest ranked woman in the new South African Defence Force. She was in charge of communication. So you had women as commanders in MK. Modise becomes a commander. I speak about the case of, why am I forgetting her first name, Williams, the former DG of communications here. Yes, Pumla Williams was a commander, and she speaks about the difficulties that some of the guerrillas had dealing with a woman commander, but also speaking about how some of the men in MK said to this MK men, she is our commander, you have to take instruction from her. So certainly there were women in leadership, but throughout, people like James Nuru make this point. Of course, MK largely is dominated by male leadership. Thanks. But sorry, Annie, the thing I wanted to say is that it's so striking to me that there's always these questions around sexual violence and the camps when it comes to women, but there's no question about what happens in Robben Island. It's assumed that the connections that happen there are about sexual violence and not romantic life and genuine consensual connections. Thanks.
I think those were the final words for today's gathering. I want to thank Professor Sanford in New York, early morning, Professor Magadla and Professor Roy for making time for this. And I want to thank you all for being with us this Monday afternoon, and everyone here at JIAS. And I hope that you can join us again in mid-November or late November. Wish you all a wonderful day or evening.